Some stories touch the heart in ways we can never forget. This is one of those stories, of love, music, and a bond that broke barriers. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, then stay with us till the end. And before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Now, let's dive in. There are moments in life when silence becomes heavier than words. In the grand mansion of a powerful millionaire, silence had reigned for years. It was not the peaceful kind of silence that comes with serenity, but the suffocating kind that grows out of loss. After the sudden passing of his wife, the man who had everything struggled to hold together the only piece of family he had left, his little daughter. But grief works in ways that even the wealthiest cannot control. The child who once ran around the house, laughing and speaking with innocence, one day simply stopped. Words no longer came, and for nearly 3 years, not a single sound escaped her lips. Specialists were brought in, therapies were tried, and money was poured into solutions. Yet, the house remained cold, and the child remained locked in silence. The father, though broken himself, kept searching for answers. What pained him most was not just the absence of his wife, but the growing distance with his daughter. He could give her the best toys, the most expensive schools, and a life of privilege, but he could not give her back her voice. In his desperation, he hired nannies, therapists, and caregivers. Most came and went, unable to break through the invisible wall that grief had built around the little girl. Each one left behind more disappointment and more hopelessness. Then came Amina, a woman unlike the others. She was quiet, patient, and steady. Where others had tried to force progress, she simply stayed present. She did not overwhelm the child with questions or demands. She created an environment of safety, filling her days with calm routines and gentle care. At first, the father doubted her methods. He was used to results, used to efficiency, used to control. But something about her presence softened the atmosphere of the house. Slowly, the mansion that had felt like a tomb began to breathe again. The daughter, though still mute, began to show signs of trust. She followed Amina from room to room, held her hand, and found comfort in her calm presence. Even without words, there was a bond growing stronger than any he had witnessed before. The father noticed it, though he did not always understand it. He only knew that for the first time in years, his child did not seem entirely lost. What no one could have expected was that the breakthrough would come not through doctors, not through therapy, not through money, but through something as simple and timeless as music. Late one night, when the mansion should have been asleep, a soft sound drifted through the halls. It was a sound unfamiliar to the grieving walls of that house, a melody. It was not grand or polished, but it carried something purer than perfection. It was the sound of Amina's voice, singing softly in the stillness of the night. And then, something happened that defied every prediction, every medical report, every hopeless verdict. The little girl, who had not spoken in years, joined in. At first, it was a faint hum, fragile and trembling, but it was there. A sound. A voice. Not just silence anymore. For a moment, the weight of grief lifted, and in its place bloomed the fragile miracle of expression. The father's world shifted in that instant. His daughter's silence, which he had come to accept as permanent, was not the end of her story. There was still a voice inside her, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right kind of love to bring it out. And it was not the professionals or the experts who had unlocked it, but the nanny he had once underestimated. A woman whose patience and compassion went deeper than any title or degree. That night marked the beginning of transformation. It was not just about a child finding her voice again. It was about a father realizing that love, healing, and connection cannot be bought, only nurtured. It was about understanding that sometimes, the people society overlooks hold the greatest power to heal wounds that wealth and status cannot touch. The silence of the mansion had finally been broken, not by wealth, not by power, but by a song. In the years that followed his wife's passing, the millionaire had tried to rebuild his home in the only way he knew how, through structure, discipline, and resources. He filled the house with tutors, doctors, and professionals, each carrying a resume of expertise and a promise to bring his daughter back to where she once had been. Yet every attempt ended in the same quiet despair. His daughter remained withdrawn, trapped in her silence, carrying an invisible weight too heavy for her young shoulders. The mansion, filled with the symbols of success, echoed with absence. It had the appearance of life, but lacked its warmth. The man himself had buried his pain under layers of work. He convinced himself that if he built more, earned more, and achieved more, somehow the ache of loss would lessen. But with every new accomplishment, he returned home to the same haunting stillness. Wealth could buy nearly everything, but not the return of laughter, not the sound of his daughter's voice, not the comfort of a family whole again. His life became a paradox, admired by the world outside but hollow within his own walls. Into this world stepped Amina, the nanny who would eventually alter the course of their lives. Unlike those before her, she did not come with rigid plans or high-priced strategies. She brought instead a gentleness rooted in experience and resilience. Her presence carried the quiet strength of someone who had lived through her own hardships and understood that healing was less about force and more about patience. She did not treat the child as a problem to be solved, but as a soul waiting to be understood. From the very beginning, her approach was different. She created an environment where the girl felt safe, not pressured. She allowed silence to exist without judgment, filling the spaces between with kindness rather than demands. The child, who had resisted every attempt to be drawn out, began to respond in subtle but powerful ways. She lingered near Amina, watched her movements, and slowly mirrored her calm. What others had failed to achieve with endless instructions and therapies, Amina accomplished simply by being present. The father noticed these changes, though he struggled to accept them fully at first. He had always believed that results required effort, that success demanded intensity. Watching his daughter respond to something as simple as patience challenged everything he thought he knew. Yet he could not deny that there was progress. The once isolated child began to follow routines again, started showing small sparks of joy, and allowed herself moments of trust. Amina's influence stretched beyond the child. The mansion itself, once suffocating in its coldness, seemed to soften under her care. The staff, who had grown used to walking on eggshells around the family, began to notice the difference too. There was less tension, less fear of doing the wrong thing. A quiet warmth replaced the sharp edges that had dominated the household for so long. Even the father, though he rarely admitted it, found himself spending more time at home rather than losing himself in endless work. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, and it was impossible to ignore. The silence of the girl was still present, but it no longer felt hopeless. Instead, it seemed as if she were preparing, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to release what had been locked away for so long. Amina understood this instinctively. She never rushed her, never forced words that were not ready to come. She built trust brick by brick, creating a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of a breakthrough when it finally came. In many ways, the relationship between the nanny and the child revealed truths about healing that the father had never considered. He had tried to conquer grief as he conquered business, through strategies and control. But grief, especially in a child, did not bend to such methods. It required patience, love, and an ability to sit with pain rather than erase it. Amina embodied this truth, and through her, the child learned once again that the world could be safe enough to risk opening her heart. The man began to see that his own healing was tied to his daughter's. Every moment she moved closer to life was a reminder of how far he had drifted from it. He had lost not only his wife but also his connection to the simple joys of fatherhood. He had let silence build walls between them, assuming it was something that could not be broken. Yet here was evidence that those walls were not permanent. Here was proof that even the deepest silence could be interrupted by compassion. The story of the child's muteness and the nanny's role in her journey became more than just a tale of a struggling family. It was a reflection of a universal truth, that love and patience often succeed where force and wealth cannot. It revealed how often society overlooks those who carry quiet wisdom, judging them by status or appearance rather than by the depth of their understanding. In the case of this family, it was not the high-profile doctors or the expensive solutions that created change, but the steady hand of a woman who believed in something greater than silence. As the days passed, the father began to view Amina with a growing respect. What had started as skepticism transformed into gratitude, though he often found it difficult to express. She was not just a caretaker for his child, but the anchor that was holding his family from drifting further into despair. Without her, the mansion would have remained a monument to loss. With her, it became a place where healing could begin. The little girl, once frozen in grief, was slowly thawing. She smiled more, engaged more, and allowed herself to feel safe in the presence of the nanny who had earned her trust. It was still a fragile process, but it was progress nonetheless. And for a father who had nearly given up hope, those small signs were nothing short of miraculous. The silence that had defined their lives for so long was beginning to shift. It was no longer a silence of despair, but a silence filled with possibility, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the child's voice would finally return. And though no one knew when that day would come, there was now a certainty that it was possible. The father, who had once believed his wealth could solve anything, was learning the most humbling lesson of all, that sometimes the answers come not from power but from love, not from control but from patience, not from money but from the unexpected wisdom of those who quietly transform lives. Even with the progress that was beginning to show, the journey was far from easy. Healing never moves in a straight line, and the road ahead was filled with setbacks, doubts, and conflicts that threatened to undo everything. The silence had not simply vanished after one moment of breakthrough. It lingered, pressing itself back into the corners of the mansion whenever grief became too heavy for the little girl to carry. The father, despite seeing hope for the first time in years, often found himself wrestling with frustration. He wanted immediate results, something tangible, something measurable. Each time his daughter slipped back into silence, his impatience returned, and the weight of disappointment grew heavier on his already burdened heart. There were days when the child seemed full of light, humming softly or making faint sounds, only for the next day to fall completely silent again. These regressions felt unbearable to the father, who was used to progress that was consistent, clear, and linear. In his world, setbacks were failures, and failures demanded correction. But in the fragile journey of a grieving child, setbacks were part of the process. They were not signs of failure, but signs that the healing was still unfolding. Amina understood this deeply, but convincing the father was another battle entirely. Tension grew between his desire for control and her insistence on patience. He had the mind of a man who built empires, where problems were solved with quick action and decisive solutions. She had the heart of someone who knew that wounds of the soul cannot be rushed. This clash of approaches created conflict, not only in how the child was cared for, but in how the father viewed himself as a parent. He struggled with guilt, often wondering if his inability to help his daughter was proof that he had failed her. At the same time, he struggled with pride, resisting the idea that someone else could reach his child in ways he could not. The conflict was not just external but internal. The father found himself torn between the world he knew and the world he was being forced to learn. He had spent years building a reputation as a man of strength, yet here he was, powerless in the face of his daughter's silence. That powerlessness became a wound of its own, one that pushed him toward anger at times and despair at others. He loved his daughter fiercely, but love without answers left him restless and consumed by helplessness. For the little girl, the struggle was equally profound. She had once known laughter and warmth, but grief had robbed her of the ability to trust her own voice. Each attempt to speak felt like a mountain to climb, and the fear of failing again often pushed her back into silence. She carried the memory of her mother's absence like a shadow, one that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. Even in moments of progress, the shadow returned, whispering that it was safer to remain quiet than to risk being hurt again. Her silence was not just about loss, but about survival. Amina, in the middle of these struggles, carried her own battles too. She was aware of the way the father's gaze often questioned her methods, and she knew the weight of being both an employee and a lifeline for the family. She carried the unspoken pressure of proving herself, not only as a caretaker but as someone capable of making a difference in a place where so many had failed. Being a black woman in a wealthy, privileged household added another layer of challenge. She was often underestimated, sometimes judged, and at times made to feel as if her presence was tolerated rather than fully welcomed. Yet she remained steady, not because it was easy, but because she believed in the child and in the possibility of healing. The conflicts between the father and the nanny reflected something larger than personal disagreements. They were a clash between two worlds, one driven by power and wealth, and the other shaped by resilience and compassion. Where he saw obstacles to be conquered, she saw wounds to be tended. Where he demanded results, she nurtured process. Their opposing perspectives often collided, creating tension that could be felt throughout the house. But underneath the conflict was a truth neither could deny. The child was slowly changing, and change was impossible to ignore. As the months passed, the mansion became a battlefield of emotions. There were moments of joy when the girl made progress, followed by moments of despair when the silence returned. Each high was fragile, each low a reminder of how far they still had to go. For the father, the unpredictability was maddening. For Amina, it was proof of the slow rhythm of healing. For the child, it was the reality of living between two worlds, the world of grief that pulled her backward and the world of hope that pulled her forward. The greatest conflict, however, was not between the father and the nanny, nor between wealth and patience. It was within the father himself. He struggled to accept that his money and power could not solve everything. He had built his life on control, but here was the one thing he could not control, the voice of his own daughter. That truth humbled him in ways he could not have imagined. It forced him to confront not only his grief but also the limits of his influence. In many ways, it was the hardest lesson of his life. What made the struggle even more profound was the fear of failure. Every time his daughter retreated into silence, he feared it was permanent. Every time she resisted progress, he feared she would never recover. The weight of those fears pressed heavily on him, shaping his actions, his emotions, and his relationship with both his child and her caregiver. Yet despite the fears, despite the setbacks, the journey continued. Conflict has a way of testing the strength of bonds, and in this household, it did exactly that. The father and the nanny clashed, but they also began to understand one another in new ways. The girl struggled, but she also discovered that she was not alone. Each battle revealed not only the depth of the wounds but also the strength it would take to overcome them. In the midst of setbacks, there was still progress, fragile but undeniable. The struggle was far from over, but within it lay the seeds of transformation. The mansion, once a place of silence and grief, was now alive with the tension of growth. Healing had not yet fully arrived, but it had begun, and even conflict could not stop it. The father's world was shifting, the nanny's presence was proving essential, and the child was learning that her voice, though fragile, was still hers to claim. The struggle, as painful as it was, became the crucible in which healing was being forged. Every journey of transformation carries a moment when the balance shifts, when all of the pain and struggle that seemed endless begins to open into possibility. For the grieving household, that moment arrived not in grandeur or spectacle, but in something ordinary that revealed itself to be extraordinary. The child who had lived in silence began to risk her voice more often, testing it in fragile hums, allowing single sounds to escape as though she were learning how to breathe for the first time. Each attempt was imperfect, but each was evidence that the silence was no longer absolute. The process of reaching that turning point was slow, almost invisible in its daily progress. Weeks of effort, patience, and trust-building accumulated until the impossible became possible. What had once seemed like a permanent condition revealed itself to be a temporary wall, one that could be chipped away piece by piece. The turning point was not just about sound emerging from silence. It was about the child realizing that her voice was safe to use again. It was about trust strong enough to replace fear, and about love powerful enough to carry her across the threshold of grief. For the father, the resolution began with recognition. He finally understood that the path forward was not about control or wealth but about surrender. He realized that he could not demand his daughter's healing on his own terms. He had to let go of the belief that money could buy answers, and instead accept that healing required vulnerability. It was not easy for him, but slowly, he began to soften. He stopped measuring progress in numbers or timelines, and he started to value the small victories as if they were treasures. A faint hum, a whispered sound, a smile that carried confidence, each became a milestone worth celebrating. This turning point transformed his relationship with Amina as well. Where there had once been skepticism and tension, there grew respect and trust. He came to see her not as an employee filling a role, but as a guide who had given his daughter something no one else could. He began to understand that her patience and compassion were not weaknesses but strengths far greater than the tools he had relied on his whole life. The resolution of conflict between them came not through argument but through shared purpose, united in the mission of helping the child rediscover herself. For the child, the turning point was a moment of bravery. It was the realization that her voice was not broken, that it still belonged to her, and that she could use it without fear. The journey of grief had silenced her for so long, convincing her that speaking again would only reopen wounds, but the gentle presence of love had shifted that belief. She discovered that her voice could be more than a reminder of what she had lost. It could be a way to rebuild what remained. This discovery gave her the courage to continue, step by step, until speaking became less of a struggle and more of a joy. The household itself began to transform. The The silence that had once defined it was now broken regularly by sounds of life. Music became part of the atmosphere, laughter began to reappear, and the mansion no longer felt like a museum of grief. It became a home again, not because of wealth or grandeur, but because the people within it were reconnecting. The turning point was not only in the child's healing, but in the revival of the entire family. Resolution also meant reconciliation with the past. The father learned to honor the memory of his wife not by clinging to grief, but by embracing the life their daughter still had ahead of her. He came to understand that moving forward was not betrayal but continuation. His daughter's voice was a living tribute to the love that had once filled their home, proof that what had been lost could still echo forward in new forms. In this way, healing was not about forgetting but about carrying memory in a way that did not suffocate life. The nanny's role in the resolution was profound. She had stepped into a place of brokenness and offered something simple yet powerful: patience, compassion, and belief. Through her, the family had rediscovered what they thought they had lost forever. The resolution was not only about the child speaking again, but about the father learning humility and gratitude. He discovered that true strength lay not in control but in the courage to let others help, even when pride resisted. The resolution brought with it a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. It did not erase the pain of the past, nor did it promise a life without challenges. But it created a foundation of hope strong enough to withstand setbacks. It provided a reminder that healing is not about perfection but about progress, not about immediate transformation but about gradual rebirth. The turning point became the beginning of a new chapter. Where silence once dominated, there was now possibility. Where grief had paralyzed, there was now growth. The child, the father, and the nanny had all been transformed by the journey, each learning lessons that would shape the rest of their lives. The father learned that love could not be forced, the child learned that her voice still mattered, and the nanny proved that compassion could accomplish what power could not. Resolution also carried a lesson for the world beyond the walls of the mansion. It reminded anyone who heard the story that healing often comes from unexpected places, that the people society underestimates may hold the greatest wisdom, and that the most valuable breakthroughs are not those achieved through wealth but those born from love. The transformation of this family became a quiet testimony to the truth that human connection is more powerful than any fortune. In the end, the resolution was not about a single miraculous moment but about the accumulation of countless small acts of love, patience, and courage. It was about a child who found her voice, a father who found humility, and a nanny who revealed the strength of compassion. It was about the silence that once seemed permanent giving way to a song that would never be forgotten. The turning point was proof that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope can return, voices can be found, and life can begin again. The days that followed brought with them a transformation so profound that it seemed almost surreal. For years, silence had been the dominant sound in the household, an emptiness that hung heavy in the air. Yet now, laughter and melody filled every corner. What had once been a mansion defined by its wealth and grandeur suddenly became a home defined by warmth and connection. The young girl who had been trapped in her world of silence was now free, her voice echoing through the halls in playful songs and innocent giggles. What no doctor, therapist, or specialist had been able to unlock, the touch of human kindness and the power of music had achieved. For the millionaire father, the transformation of his daughter became a mirror reflecting the changes he needed within himself. He had spent years focusing on building his empire, equating success with the weight of his bank account and the influence of his name. Yet, in those quiet evenings when he heard his daughter singing softly with a woman he had once viewed with suspicion, he realized how much he had missed. He recognized that wealth could never heal wounds of the soul, and that what his daughter had craved all along was not another toy, a lavish vacation, or the latest innovation. It was love, presence, and a genuine human connection. The nanny's role in this transformation could not be overstated. She had entered a world where she was judged by her skin color, by her background, by assumptions rooted in prejudice. She had been hired reluctantly, almost as an afterthought, and tolerated rather than welcomed. Yet she had carried herself with dignity, compassion, and resilience. She had never demanded recognition, never fought for validation, never sought to prove herself through words. Instead, she let her actions speak. In her patience, in the gentle rhythm of her lullabies, in the steady consistency of her care, she gave the little girl the stability and trust she needed. What began as an ordinary job became an extraordinary calling. As the father grew closer to his daughter through the doorway the nanny had opened, his view of the nanny herself began to shift. Where once he had seen only the surface, he now saw the depth. He recognized the strength it took for her to hold her ground in a world that often dismissed people like her. He acknowledged the courage it required to nurture a child in a space where she had been treated as invisible. And most importantly, he began to see her not as a hired hand, but as the bridge that reunited him with his daughter. That recognition became the foundation of his personal growth. The community surrounding them soon took notice as well. Where whispers had once carried judgment about the nanny's presence in the wealthy home, admiration began to take root. Neighbors, relatives, and even colleagues who had looked at her with suspicion began to soften their views when they saw the miracle unfolding before their eyes. It wasn't just the child's transformation that amazed them, it was the realization that compassion knows no boundaries, that love can flourish in the most unexpected places, and that prejudice blinds us from recognizing the gifts others bring into our lives. The child's voice became a symbol in itself. Every note she sang was a declaration that barriers could be broken. Her laughter was not just the sound of a little girl discovering her joy, it was the sound of walls crumbling, of healing taking root, of humanity rediscovering itself. The father, humbled and grateful, began to embrace the very lessons he had once resisted. He learned that vulnerability is not weakness, that humility is not defeat, and that recognizing one's flaws is the first step toward transformation. In the quiet moments, he often reflected on how differently his daughter's story might have unfolded if not for the courage and grace of the nanny. What if he had dismissed her too quickly? What if his pride had prevented him from seeing her worth? What if he had continued to chase only wealth, blind to the treasures within his own home? These questions lingered in his mind, serving as reminders that life's greatest gifts often arrive in unexpected forms. The nanny, however, never sought acknowledgement or glory. For her, the reward was seeing the little girl blossom, hearing her voice ring out after years of silence, and watching a family rediscover itself. She knew that the story was bigger than her, bigger than the father, bigger than even the child. It was about love transcending prejudice, about music breaking barriers, about humanity rising above its flaws. And though she remained humble, those around her knew that her presence had changed everything. As time went on, the bond between the nanny and the family only grew stronger. She became more than an employee. She became part of the home. The father, once rigid and distant, began to embrace her as a partner in raising his daughter. He offered her respect, trust, and the acknowledgement she had long deserved. For the daughter, the nanny remained a beacon of safety, joy, and unconditional love. Together, they created a harmony that no wealth could ever buy. The story of this family is a reminder to us all. It teaches that healing can come from the most unexpected places, that prejudice blinds us from recognizing the beauty in others, and that the simplest acts of kindness can transform lives in ways unimaginable. It shows us that love is not bound by race, status, or wealth. It is bound only by the heart willing to give and receive it. And so, the tale concludes not with an ending, but with a beginning. A child found her voice. A father found his heart. A nanny found her rightful place in a world that had once doubted her. Together, they created a story of resilience, transformation, and unity. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded us that music, compassion, and love remain the greatest forces of change. This was not just the story of a millionaire's daughter, or a nanny, or even a father. It is the story of all of us. A story that urges us to look beyond appearances, to listen beyond silence, and to choose love in the face of prejudice. Because in the end, it is not our wealth, status, or power that defines us, it is the unseen struggles we overcome, and the way we lift each other along the way. And that, dear listener, is the journey of a child who found her voice, a father who found his heart, and a woman whose strength broke down barriers of silence and prejudice. At Unseen Struggle, we share stories that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary power of love. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing tales. Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what part of this journey inspired you the most. Until next time, remember, every unseen struggle hides a story worth telling.